I talk to you today about the four mass circulation magazines that are aimed mainly at married women. That's McCall's, the Ladies' Home Journal, Red Book, and Good Housekeeping. Now, the combined circulation of these four magazines totals nearly 35 million copies per month, and all of them are now under male editorship. They have a lot of things in common. They are alike in their determination to sway in any wind of change if it has to do with hairdos or window treatments in the home. They follow nearly any what's called a women's fad that surfaces. Currently, the natural way to live and eat is big in the ladies' magazines, along with articles on the author of Jonathan Livingston Seagull, complicated needlework, the return of what is called the ladylike look, speculation on the Kennedys, many new ways to diet, and something called quick gourmet cookery. But the magazine's fiction cannot be included in this generalization about change, for its themes, its formulas, and the many myths that it builds upon remain remarkably constant month after month. Cosmopolitan cannot be included in this group because for the last 8 years, under the editorship of Helen Gurley Brown, it has moved to softcore pornography and appeals to something called the single swinger. The new magazine, Ms., is aimed simply at women in general and is not comparable to the others either. McCall's, too, has changed a great deal in the last few years. It now prints very little fiction, and then only that done by big names such as Joyce Carol Oates. But the journal, Red Book, and Good Housekeeping, although they vary somewhat in their levels of sophistication and their awareness of the world, differ very little in the fiction they print. Their stories, whether short, or as Red Book actually bills them, bonus short, that's a half a page, present a highly defined and little varying image of woman, her status, her role, her desires, her problems, and her solutions to those problems. The plots of the stories adhere to about half a dozen very rigidly followed formulas. Girl meets boy, misunderstanding occurs between husband and wife, problem child raises difficulties for parents, an old friend from a woman's past reappears, a husband or wife yearns for adventure or travel, or a family crisis occurs. For example, father is caught in a blizzard and can't get home for Christmas. All my examples are real examples. These formulas are too limited to bear much discussion, although later I will get into the problems of resolving some of these plot formulas. The interest of the stories lies instead in the roles played by those who move within the formulas and the myths on which are built the solutions for the problems posed. Throughout nearly all of the stories, no matter in which of the magazines they appear, the same undercurrents of myth are sliding around. Love occurs at first sight. Love means total agreement and instantaneous silent communication between man and woman. Marriage is the consummation of this love, but marriage is empty and dreadful without children. One child is better than none, but that one child will probably become warped or uncommunicative or sissified if he does not have siblings. A married woman, whether she has children or not, belongs in the home. Motherhood is the first and final fulfillment of the woman. A mysterious bond exists between a mother and her child, a bond in which the father does not share. No one else can care for a woman's children or her home as well as she can. A woman should be satisfied with what she has and not long for foolish things like romance, adventure, travel. When a woman marries, she gives her life to her husband and should sever ties with her past, and so the litany runs. As one can see, adherence to these myths dictates not only a woman's value system, but also her lifestyle, how she thinks, and the things she thinks about. The body of these stories forms a set of directions for living, a manual on how to achieve happiness, fulfillment, and even freedom, but always how to achieve these things as a woman. To find the right man, to marry him, to have children is to actualize the myth. To deviate from it out of selfishness or whim, and these are the only motives offered for such deviation, is to court personal disaster. Although the stories focus most of the time on women, men do appear in them too, but usually as background or props. Even when the narrator is a man, the story he tells almost always focuses on a woman. Of nearly 150 stories under study here, representing the period between late 1967 and the present, about a dozen had a male point of view, and all but one of these still focused on the woman the man was interested in. The single men in the stories are usually advertising men, insurance executives, or writers, writers of what one does not know. Descriptions of these men dwell on twinkling eyes, heavy shocks of black or brown hair, never red or blonde in 150 stories, and white, even teeth. The descriptions tend to begin and end above the neck. The husbands in the stories are even more shadowy. They have usually retained their twinkling eyes from bachelorhood, but little else is said of them. In one Red Book story, for example, Leonard, the high school teacher husband, is described only as incredibly good looking. The husbands' jobs are also less well defined than those of the single men, although several of them are teachers, and no single males in these stories are ever teachers. Very frequently, the husband travels, and this is only a convenient gimmick to get him out of the story. If he isn't on the road, he often has to work nights in order to speed his rise in the business, which is also undefined. If nothing else, he commutes to work in the city while the wife and children stay in the suburbs or classy semi-rural area, playing out their roles in this new American pastoral. If the nature of the husband's work is made very specific in the story, it is usually a sign of trouble. In a journal story titled May I Ask Who's Calling, the husband's occupation is very specific. He is described as a dedicated and serious professor of ancient history. And there's the problem. His students are equally dedicated, and female students are always calling him at home and refusing to leave their names when he is not in to talk to them. Why don't they want me to know who they are, thinks his wife, who is a mother of 3, by the way. One day, one of these mysterious female students actually comes over to the house. She and the professor sit in the living room and speak of ancient history in low voices. The wife listens in on as much as she can. After all, she's had a few years of practice in listening in on those phone conversations of his. Says the student, "Did your wife used to be a student or a teacher or anything?" What a stinger! 3 paragraphs later, the wife has resolved to become one of her husband's students and buy herself a mini skirt and a fuzzy pink sweater like the one the student has on. "I am going to do all the term papers," she says, "and take all the exams and shock him with my intelligence in our discussions at home. And best of all, I am going to get an A in his course." The end. It is the end. Now, this story raises more questions than one may want to think about here, but let it suffice for now to say that whenever one learns very much about the husband in a story, it is a sign that his job will be the problem in the story. If his work is not a problem, his work does not matter. Besides, the husband is not much use when he is around. Sometimes he offers at a moment of crisis a flower he picked in the backyard. Sometimes he kisses the top of his wife's head in a consoling manner. Occasionally he goes out for ice cream. In only one story did the husband have to babysit with the children while his weary wife went to the beauty shop. When she returned home, she found him very angry. The children had been a bother, and he had not had a chance to do the work he had brought home from the office. The wife resolves not to put him into such a difficult situation again. Men, especially if they're married, are very minor. They bring home the bread. It is the woman and her path to true womanliness that is the focus. The myths I enumerated earlier are built up throughout the various life stages seen in the stories and through a series of initiations into the ever greater mysteries of womanhood. Life begins in the temporary and not very desirable state of being single. A couple of years ago, one could not find in these stories a single woman who was less than 21 or more than 23. If she had reached 23, her situation was perhaps becoming a bit desperate, her existence harder to justify. But in 1972, the ladies' magazines together produced 5 stories about older single women, even as old as 26. All of them were involved in what are ominously described as complex personal relationships with men. Sometimes the single woman in these stories is college educated, and if so, she works as a grade school teacher. Always. Her job, however, is only mentioned, for one never sees her at work or hears her talking about her work. Indeed, there is no sign that she thinks about it at all. Frequently, she is on vacation for the duration of the story. If she is not college educated, she works as a stenographer, a secretary, or a billing clerk. We do see this woman at work, but instead of working, she is likely to be accepting or turning down dates, getting drinks of water, or hoping to catch the eye of a likely male. Although it is okay for her to have a job, she is not expected or even allowed to have a career. Out of 35 or so single woman stories, I found only 2 in which the woman had a career of a sort, and both stories were enough to warn anyone away from attempting such. In a journal story called A Day in Fun City, the single woman is a freelance pornographer. She is having an affair with a writer, a bit vague here again, but finds that he has plagiarized from her unpublished sonnet sequence and becomes disenchanted with him. In fact, everything goes wrong for her. She goes to see her publisher in grubby old clothes and loses his esteem. She tries to buy a $1,500 painting that she can't afford and that the gallery owner will not sell to her because she is so badly dressed, and she is lonely, lonely, lonely. The better way to be single is exemplified by Sarah, the stenographer heroine of a Red Book story called A Matter of Style. Sarah is looking for a man who is a bit different. Many of these young women want a different type of man, but this desire for a nonconformist male is usually satisfied by a fellow who rolls up his shirt sleeves or shows up tieless for a date or reads a book. Well, Sarah meets Sam, an advertising man at a dance. She is so attracted to him that she takes to prowling bars and pool halls and to seeing the same Eugene O'Neill play 4 times over in order to try to meet him again. She succeeds, and he invites her up to his place to hear a tape-recorded reading from Camus' The Stranger. She has never heard of the book, and she doesn't like it because the selection read is about the wind. Sarah says, "I don't think any woman likes the wind. It blows your hair and makes a mess. The wind is disruptive. Women like routine and ritual." Well, Sam sees by this that he has a real woman on his hands. So he invites her to stay the night with him. She refuses, saying only, "It's the way I'm programmed." He now is not only attracted to her, but can respect her as well. So he makes another date for the next day. She accepts and then leaves, knowing that she has found the right man. The older single girls that I mentioned earlier, the ones who are involved in those complex personal relationships, have always resolved to marry by the end of the story, even if the story is only one of those half-page Red Book specials. The story in which the woman says, "Oh, this single life is really great, I'm not getting married," is a story that simply does not exist. 2 stories, one in Red Book and one in the Journal, published within 4 months of each other last year, have to do with a man and woman living together and sharing a pet cat. In both stories, the 2 decide to break off their affair but quarrel over who should get the cat, which they refer to as their baby, and finally decide to stay together and get married so as never to quarrel over such a thing again, and so as to have a real baby and not just an old cat baby. Another Journal story ends also with the decision to marry. The woman in this story thinks, and I quote, "She wanted to wait for him when he was out doing whatever he was doing. She wanted to put a patch on his sleeve and bake bread with honey so that those hollow cheeks of his would fill out." Must she marry him to do this, one might ask, and in the terms of the story, the answer is yes. Those images, waiting at home, patching clothes, baking bread, are specifically domestic and marital images. Only marriage qualifies one to indulge such womanly yearnings. Another example, and this is one of my favorites, is a Journal story called Remembrance of Things Future. It involves Marcia, a messy career girl living in a very messy apartment, dusty paper flowers, leaky beanbag chairs, a terrible place, and carrying on a messy affair. Marcia inherits an antique mirror from a great aunt she has not seen in years. She hangs up the mirror in her apartment, and its very presence mysteriously makes her want to clean up the place and stay home from work for a day to cook a 5-course meal for her lover. The presence of the mirror and its very powerful piece of glass makes him propose marriage to her after he has eaten the meal and even talk about having children. He says, "I'm possessive. I want to own things. You? Kids, maybe. I like stuff." After he has left, Marcia catches one last glimpse of herself in the mirror. A gray-eyed woman, not a girl, smiled back at her, the author tells us at the end of the story. Such plans for marriage can define the woman as woman, in capital letters for a while, but later, as we shall see, the definition has to be added to. For now, there are still uncertainties, for the choice of future husband must be made carefully. Divorced men are especially to be avoided, and marrying someone much beneath her will cause family problems. In a Good Housekeeping story called Dreams of a Young Girl, Arlene, a stenographer, is drawn to Dave, a divorced man, but she learns just in time that he is unreliable and a heavy drinker. In another one called The Way of a Loving Girl, the heroine's twice divorced fiance is having her followed by a private detective for reasons that are never clear in the story. She has the wisdom to dump him and marry the detective who interestingly enough, turns out to be a former English professor. Even after such hurdles have been jumped and the really unsuitable men have been selected out, there is still the engagement to be lived through, a time of further uncertainty. The young woman is about to be initiated into the great mystery of marriage and usually needs advice. In a story called The Wedding is on Tuesday, Laurie, who is engaged to Paul, has insisted on a 50-50 basis for dates during their engagement and for everything in their impending marriage. For 50% of their dates, she has chosen where they will go and has even paid for both of them. But she feels that something is wrong in their relationship. She consults her wise Aunt Beverly. Says Aunt Beverly, "Do you want your own way, or do you want him to realize once again that he just adores you?" Laurie sees that she has been wrong, confesses this to Paul, puts her head on his shoulder, and lets him pay for the movies from then on. Thus, in the acceptance of her traditional role, she finds the happiness that she did not have before. Why insist on a silly equality when it does not bring happiness, asks Janet O'Malley, the author of this story. Of course, it is hard to argue with Miss O'Malley when the concept of equality is reduced to the absurdity of shouting, "I get to choose the movie tonight." There are apparently no stories about actual weddings and few stories about early marriage. An odd hiatus occurs here, as it does in the years of a female's life between 13 and 21 and in the years after 65. From the few stories written about early marriage, one assumes that the newly married woman, who of course no longer works, is just hanging around home waiting to get impregnated. In one Red Book story, Patsy, wishing she were pregnant, puts on a maternity smock she has bought and goes out shopping, perhaps hoping that appearances will make it so. Another story called This Shining Moment is about Bonnie, who is newly married to Chet, an Air Force person, and she is very much at loose ends while he is off flying his jet. Driven by whim, Bonnie plans to run off to San Francisco. She demands picnics in the mountains. She acts very childish. But one day a neighbor asks her to babysit briefly with her 1-month-old child. Bonnie has not had much to do with babies, and she's frightened at first, but then she sits down in a rocking chair with the baby and croons to him, which is a natural talent that women have. Both of them are blissfully happy. Chet comes home to find Bonnie and the baby asleep in the rocker, and he makes a wise inference about what Bonnie needs. Apparently, a woman such as Bonnie can be somewhat ambivalent about children at first simply because she does not know how marvelous they are. A woman pregnant for the first time can also be shown as frightened of the awesome mystery and tremendous responsibility of child rearing, though not of childbirth itself, ever. But no one, whether male or female, can be shown as not wanting children at all. This is apparently not a human feeling. Pregnancy is still a delicate condition in these stories, despite modern obstetricians' efforts to dispel this myth. In a Good Housekeeping story called 2 Wishes for Christmas, Jenny, who is only 3 months pregnant, decides to go to work during the Christmas rush. Her husband is horrified. Jenny had always been a slim girl, he says. She knocked herself out cooking and cleaning and laundering, and this was obviously no time to take on even more work. He changes his mind, however, when he learns that she has gone to work in order to buy him an expensive coat he has had his eye on. The more regular path is taken by Camilla in Family Life and Early Sorrows, who sits at home painting watercolors and wondering why she cannot get on with her mother. Sarah, who spends her days fixing up a small boat and avoiding working on a master's thesis. And Susan, and Susan Hill is having a baby who mostly shops and goes out to lunch with her friends. It is in Susan Hill, though, that one learns of the real beauty of pregnancy. In the baby department of Bonwit Teller, Susan meets a slender mother of 4 who gushes over her and tells her that late pregnancy is the time to feel super female. Having a baby makes me feel more womanly, she says. Womanly, womanly, you know? This then is complete fulfillment, and Susan goes home happy, no longer jealous of her skinny, unmarried friends who have not yet known what it is to feel womanly, womanly, you know? The birth of this first baby is a very scary affair in all of the stories that deal with it. The parents are afraid to pick up the child and afraid not to pick him up. The little thing is always male, by the way. And afraid of getting his bottle too hot or too cold, no breastfed babies in these stories either, and afraid that he may have hidden defects. Of course, their worries are always dispelled. But one does infer from this sampling of early marriage, pregnancy, and first child stories that the mother is serving an apprenticeship, is being tested once again. Most of the young brides have everything to learn about marketing, cooking, or baby care. Often they are shown as simply incompetent. For example, in a Good Housekeeping story called A World to Share, Jenny, a new mother, is frightened by all the things she must remember about baby care. She thinks, that chart for marking down the feeding times, she'd never been any good at things like that. The first child poses indeed some of the more serious dangers encountered in these stories, especially if that child remains the only child for more than 2 years. One 11-year-old child in a journal story becomes a kleptomaniac. Another one in a Good Housekeeping story robs a bank and is jailed for life. A third one from another journal story is so lonely that he befriends a stray dog on Christmas. And a fourth one is a complete sissy who comes home crying from school every day and refuses to defend himself. The parents, too, suffer from having only one child. Either they neglect him and suffer from guilt, or they become so overprotective of him that their marriage suffers. The solution is offered in a Red Book story called Two, in which Sandy, the mother of a 2-year-old boy, is having serious problems with her child's temper tantrums. She finally realizes the source of the problem. She has been treating him as if he were still a baby. If she wants a baby, she decides she had best have another one and let the 2-year-old become a boy. So the larger and larger family is then the answer. Red Book opts for at least 2 children in its stories, Good Housekeeping for a minimum of 3 and sometimes as many as 5. News of overpopulation has not reached any of these authors. A large family is frowned upon only in one Red Book story called A Shame About Margaret Ann, in which a woman with tuberculosis dies in giving birth to a 5th child. In other words, don't do it if you're not healthy. If one child is fulfilling, logically each further child will be more fulfilling, and not only that, but liberating too. In a Good Housekeeping story called The Trouble with Carol and Ellen, Ellen is 27 and pregnant with her 5th child. She is visited by her sister Carol, who is 29, twice divorced, and childless. Carol is slim and beautifully dressed, but she is awkward around the children, and she very obviously pities Ellen. After Carol has gone off to what is called a swinging 4-day party on the Cape, Ellen thinks sadly, poor Carol, she doesn't really understand at all what it means to be free. Perhaps the reader doesn't understand it either, but no matter. This story, and many others, ask only that the reader be reverent when confronting woman in her traditional role. In its context, one is not to dismiss Ellen as a stereotype, for in giving herself up to her role, in subordinating herself to a stereotype of the self, she has become truly free. That is, free of the burden of any identity except that of wife and mother. Of course, even after marriage and X number of children, pitfalls remain. Curiously, many of the women in the stories have no friends and do not even know their neighbors well enough to ask them for help in a crisis. In a journal story called The Storm, a woman falls down the cellar stairs and breaks, the author leads us to infer, an important bone. Which one is not explained. She must rely on her 4-year-old son to take care of her and the baby for a full day since her husband is off traveling. At the end of the story, however, she does not resent the limitations of a world in which no one called her, no one dropped by who might have helped, and there was no one to send her 4-year-old son out to get. Instead, she thinks, until the children were much older, she could not become deeply involved with the world around her. Several recent stories point out which direction not to turn in for satisfaction if things begin to look a little grim, and that is the direction of amassing great wealth. All of the people in these stories are, of course, well enough off. Some are middle class, more are upper middle class. A large share of the magazine's content is, after all, devoted to teaching the readers to want this status, to want to consume more and more expensive goods, and to know the best ways to display them. The photos of highly decorated rooms in the magazines show furnishings a bit beyond the means of most of the readers. The hobbies, the needlework, the rug hooking projects offered for sale by the magazines themselves are quite expensive, and the beauty makeovers would also put a dent in the middle class budget. But the stories tell the reader that while wanting to consume more and more is fine, wanting to be filthy rich is not fine. The very rich are different from you and me, said Fitzgerald. Yes, say McCall's in the Journal especially. The very rich are just miserably unhappy people. In one story, a family is visited by an old friend who has become enormously wealthy. The family is a bit intimidated by her until they learn that she has an incurable disease. In another one, we find a wealthy woman and her daughter squabbling their lives away in a decayed old mansion because they cannot settle who should get more of the millions that lie in a bank somewhere. In still another, we get a young and very wealthy couple from San Francisco who are vacationing in Mexico. They find themselves attracted to others but are too apathetic to do anything about it. They go shopping, but they find nothing to buy. At the end of the story, the woman sobs, "There's nothing I want." Well, there's the message. Don't ever wish for an end to those consumer desires, because upward striving contains its own built-in satisfactions, and when there's nothing left to want, there's simply nothing left at all. Another relatively frequent theme is the desire for romance and adventure in what seems at times to be a boring, thoroughly ritualized life. These desires are always dangerous and are always resolved or dissolved. In a Red Book story called "I Wonder If I Have Any Inner Value I Don't Know About," a mother who has spent the day dreaming about running away manages to conclude by evening, I quote, "How vital, how necessary are all the ingredients of my world. The noise, dangerous, and are always resolved or dissolved." In a Red Book story called "I Wonder If I Have Any Inner Value I Don't Know About," a mother who has spent the day dreaming about running away manages to conclude by evening, I quote, "How vital, how necessary are all the ingredients of my world. The noise, confusion, illogic, anger, crumbs on the carpet, and love." In another story called "Color Now with Europe," a mother of two spends the day looking at National Geographics and yearning to get away. But by the end of the day, she says that she won't mind waiting because it will be one precious day at a time, so we won't miss anything, and the places will still be there when we're ready. One mother of three goes so far as to write a note to an old college boyfriend. Weeks later, he calls. He is drunk and lonely. He says he is taking a plane out to see her. She is horrified and hangs up the phone. She decides that it was dangerous to remember when she was young and just beginning to have power. Another mother of three is wandering through the Metropolitan Museum when a man tries to pick her up. He gives her his card, but after 2,000 words of thinking it over, she throws away the card on her way out of the museum and says that it just doesn't belong in her handbag with all the cards from the pediatrician, the veterinarian, and the orthodontist. In the last 2 years, the discontents that arise in the home have become much harder for the writers and the readers to deal with. Now the woman must sometimes worry about a restless or preoccupied husband, how to bind him to the family. In the latest issue of Good Housekeeping, there is a story called "Emergency," in which the husband brings home a swinging bachelor co-worker for dinner. They talk endlessly of travel and gambling and women and fast cars, and they ignore the wife, and she's very troubled by it. She is also worried because her husband has been a bit restless and distant lately. Then the emergency occurs. The two children have been told to play upstairs, obviously an unnatural situation, while the grown-ups eat. The little girl falls and cuts her head badly. They must rush her to the hospital. Back home again, the husband confesses that he feels sorry for Tony, the swinging bachelor. He can't seem to love, really love, he says. Much rejoicing on the part of the wife, who concludes that he, the husband, would always come back to where he really wanted to be, that is, in the home. The reader, however, may be left asking how many family crises can occur in time to bring the husband back to where he really wanted to be. Keeping the woman where she should be gets more difficult nowadays, too, and the resolutions of the discontent formula stories are sometimes very hard to understand. Oh, says the reader, she was unhappy at the beginning of the story, and now she's happy at the end of it. Some are even more ambiguous than that. When I was an undergraduate, I had a teacher of writing who told us that she could not bear to read another story that ended with, "She threw the violets on the chair and stared out the window." Well, some of these endings, for lack of any understandable resolution, are very close to violet throwing, in my terms. In a Red Book story called The Web of Days, a woman who seems to be pretty miserable with the routine of all that housework and childcare, tired of answering the questions of her 3 children, has a dream of huge webs strung from tree to tree and meshing her on all sides. In the dream, she tries to break the webs and brush them away. She tries to get out until she spots her children perched up in the trees. They are calling out questions to her, and she accepts. The webs, she says, are no longer threatening. Although still confining, they are also just necessary. Sometimes it is one of those crazy liberated ideas that causes the discontent. In one journal story called The Last Don Juan, we find Emma, a woman with 1 child and a real paragon of a husband who works around the house even at the really menial stuff. When the baby cries at night, he is always the one to get up. In a situation that is just too complex and peculiar to explain, Emma goes out to dinner with a friend of her husband, a man with a reputation as a Don Juan. Well, he tries the standard seduction ploys, and she really tells him off, and then she comes home and goes to bed. The baby cries, and her husband starts to get up. No, she says, she will go for the first time since the baby was born. I'll read to you a little bit from the story. In the dark of the child's room, bending over the bassinet, Emma sang to her baby. Her voice became soft and pink and full of little round words. She swept the baby up in her arms and stunned him with this unprecedented midnight motherliness into prompt silence and back to sleep. She returned to the bedroom full of pride. You know what? Joshua fell asleep just like that. A mother's arms are something else. What's wrong with mine? Asks the husband. Nothing, she says, nothing at all, only they fit me much better than they fit the baby. Well, no more discontent for Emma. From now on, she will do all the getting up at night. Once she gets those crazy ideas out of her head and assumes her proper role and functions in the home, she and everybody around her will be much happier. If things start to look excessively bleak, there is always the one surefire solution: have another baby. Several stories deal with women in their late 30s and early 40s who start a new family in order to put interest back into their lives. Have a baby, go to the beauty shop, buy a pair of flowered lounging pajamas. These are all good solutions in the ladies' magazines to boredom and frustration. Or try a new recipe, get a book out of the library, go to a play with your husband. Do just about anything except go to work. Separation is bad, divorce is bad, but nothing is quite so bad as a mother taking a job. For a long time, Good Housekeeping printed no stories dealing with mothers who worked outside the home. As far as Good Housekeeping was concerned, such people did not exist. Red Book, the Journal, and McCall's have printed stories about mothers who work or workers who have children, whichever you prefer. But the women are always suitably punished in them, and no full-time housewife and mother would want to trade her life for that of one of these unfortunates. In a Red Book story called The Happy Life, The mother comes home to find the babysitter eating pretzels and watching TV while the child has been lying weeping on the cold floor of the apartment house vestibule for 2.5 hours because she was unable to reach the buzzer to open the inside door and the babysitter never came down to look for her. In another one called Woman's Lib, the Tooth Fairy, and Other Myths, a mother of two must quit her job for a month because of some undefined nervous ailment. Once home, she finds that she scarcely knows her children. Much must be explained to her by her 5-year-old son. She starts learning to cook and finds she can do without the cleaning woman who didn't do a good job anyway. By the end of the story, she is finding peace and happiness in arranging crepe paper streamers for her daughter's birthday party. It is clear enough that she will not need or want to return to work. As she watches the children at the party, she says, "I am at the center of the maypole. I can almost see the ribbons they are binding me with and meshing me, weaving onto me a bright pattern of their needs. I am liberated, but not free. With luck, I will never be free, but bound forever." Sometimes the punishment for the woman's working is simply the decay of the marriage, signaled by the adoption of separate bedrooms or by suspected casual affairs on the part of the husband. A Good Housekeeping story from the issue now on the newsstands, January 73, illustrates very well this still prevailing attitude. This story is called When We Have Enough, and it's about Connie and Dan and their little daughter Betsy. They live in an unsatisfactory old duplex with a crabby landlady downstairs, and they yearn to move into a ranch house, which is described in the story in terms of thick carpeting, all new furniture, avocado-colored appliances, and velvet chairs. To this end, Connie works at an insurance company from 4 p.m. to 12 midnight. Her boss told her she could work any hours she wanted to, and she chose 4 to 12 so that her husband could be with their daughter while she was gone. But problems abound. By the time Connie returns from work, her husband is sound asleep, and so they have little time to talk to each other and no sex life anymore. Her husband complains that he never feels like eating the food she leaves in the refrigerator for him. Her sister tells her that she is making a bigger mistake than she's willing to face. And she comes home one night to find black shoe polish all over their one new piece of furniture. Her husband tells her that their child got into the cleaning cupboard, took the shoe polish, and daubed the sofa with it while he was somehow busy elsewhere. Now, we don't see what finally makes Connie change her mind about working, and we don't see her in the process of changing it. We only learn that she changed her mind at some point. We see her driving home from her last night on the job, full of cheer, excited at the thought of moving into the old roomy house they have bought instead of the flashy ranch house they once desired. This story has lots of messages. Connie works for only one reason, to make money in order to buy things, that is the ranch house. And no other possible reason is acknowledged. Then there are her hours. Why did she choose to work from 4 to 12? Why not 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. or 8 a.m. to 4 p.m.? Well, the answer again is partly greed. Connie wants to work while her husband is home so she won't have to pay a babysitter. She will thereby be able to save more money for that ranch house. The story also tells us that a woman who works will neglect important things like putting a lock on the cupboard with the cleaning agents and shoe polishes in it. We also see that only the mother can take proper care of the child, for the father, even though he may have the best of intentions, is just naturally neglectful. The story defends another variety of traditional social arrangement. At one point before Connie quits her job, Connie and Dan are discussing how long it will take them to save enough money for the ranch house. And Connie says to Dan, "If only they'd count in my salary too, our income would be enough to get the mortgage we need." "You can't blame them," Dan said. "We certainly never plan to go on living this way forever." Connie says, "But how do they know I want to have another baby before 25 years are up?" Dan laughed. "I would say maybe they've had experience with 1 or 2 cases like ours already." So that's all okay too. They will have more babies, and the bankers are right about women after all. All of this wonderfulness allows Connie to conclude at the end of the story that it's foolish not to set up your life so you can stay home together and enjoy it. So much for women who work outside the home. Thus, the woman's world is a narrow one. Relatives mostly live far away. Friends are few, non-existent, or unsuitable. Neighbors are strangers or nosy people to be avoided. For the woman, there is only the family and the immediate concerns of the family. The lives of those in the stories are untouched by the war, by poverty, disease, elections, local issues, school boards, moonshots. The women in the stories do no volunteer work and are not even involved in Girl Scouts or the PTA. They rarely go to church or to the movies. They talk or quarrel with their husbands only about family or personal matters, but not about money, a forbidden topic which receives scarcely a single mention. Sex and sexuality are also startlingly absent from most of the stories. While the consummation of pre-marriage romantic love, except in those few affair stories, is a passionate kiss during which both parties remain standing, the consummation of marital love is usually a kiss on the cheek or the top of the head. In one Red Book story, the reader actually finds the husband and wife in the bedroom together at night. But the wife is in the bed while the husband is in a sleeping bag on the floor, prepping for a camping trip he is about to take without her. Almost no ethnic, racial, or religious minorities figure in the stories. One recent McCall story titled In Memory deals with a Jewish family. They are quite wealthy and have recently joined a very upper-class suburban synagogue. The story is a very odd one. The writer seems to be working hard to create the impression that their Judaism is merely fashionable for them. The synagogue is described in very plush detail, and we are told that the rabbi is careful to uphold the traditions, but also careful not to offend anyone with them. Carol, the central character, lights a memorial candle on the anniversary of her father's death, but is uncomfortable in explaining the meaning of the traditional candle to her Irish Catholic babysitter. Carol and her husband go to the opera that evening, even though Carol feels that perhaps she should have stayed home. They return home to find a fire engine in front of their house. The neighbors, improbably enough, saw the candle in the darkened house and, assuming the house was on fire, called the fire department. The candle, which was to have been left burning until all the wax was gone, has been blown out. It is, as I said earlier, a very odd story. One cannot escape feeling that the author is telling us that traditional religion simply has no place in the happy suburban setting, and that looking for meaning in religion is insufficiently modern. There are also in these stories no old people, no college students, no teenagers except for an occasional group of faceless toughs or a few pathetic youngsters puffing pot on a subway platform just glimpsed from the window of a train by the major character. Children tend to disappear from the stories at age 13 and reappear at age 21 when apparently all the worst is over. Through this very limited, sexless world, the woman moves, both she and her family turning ever back to herself as the repository of all womanly values. She is the sentimental recorder, keeping track of such events as the 6th anniversary of Timmy's first tooth. She is compassionate. She is generous to the point that she no longer has or else works to erase desires of her own and wants only what her husband and children desire. She is intuitive. She is gifted at times with extraordinary perceptions. In the middle of the second act of a play, she can sense that her daughter is ill and she rushes home to be proved right. She is innately wise, and she is the preserver of tradition in the home, the steady center that holds everything together. But she is also ignorant of the world beyond the home and frequently fearful of it too. Sometimes she is simply dumb. In a journal story titled 315-35989, Where Did You Go?, we find a mother of 4 who locates her Social Security card, which has been lost for the past 10 years. All these years, she has been just making up random numbers when asked for her Social Security number. And we are to believe that she has never realized there is anything confused about this system of dealing with the feds. The author of the story obviously wishes us to see such mental confusion as having a kind of helpless feminine charm. After all, numbers and even accuracy itself belong to the man's world, don't they? For the reader, however, it is hard to see it as anything but dumb. Outside of the kitchen, the woman is passive, and she is totally unequipped to make decisions. If her husband is not there to make them, the duty falls to her son, even if he is only 7 or 8 years old. If there is no husband there and there are no sons, even a German Shepherd dog can decide for her, as he does for a widow with 2 daughters in one of these stories, who should be allowed to approach the home and who should not. The woman cannot reason her way to a conclusion, but can only guess at it, and she cannot cope with change. Her skills and accomplishments are limited. In a Good Housekeeping story called To Live the Dream, the reader is told that Sarah was good at cooking gourmet dishes, arranging flowers, and identifying china by its markings. Left to herself, the woman would be without means of support and, more serious, without identity, for her identity as wife and mother exists solely in relation to others. This womanly legacy, though, is one to be passed on. In a story called We Learn by Loving, the mother realizes that her 9-year-old daughter, who has just saved the baby from inhaling smoke from a smudge, is really growing up. "Come on, young lady," says the mother. "I think it's time I taught you how to bake a cake." "Really, Mom?" Lizzie's grin was a mixture of pride and surprise. "Oh boy," she said. The womanly legacy and the early assumption of the woman's role are most perfectly formulated in a Good Housekeeping story called Someone Missing at the Manger. 9-year-old Marcy has spent months looking forward to the Christmas pageant at church. Her mother, father, and brother are all to be participants, and her only problem is understanding why there are no little girls in the Christmas scene. Then the baby comes down with chicken pox on Christmas Eve, and there are no babysitters to be had. Marcy volunteers to stay home with the baby so the others can take their places in the pageant. After they have all gone to church, Marcy understands why things have worked out as they did. I'll read to you from the story, the end of it. Suddenly she knew, in a crystal moment of understanding, why there were never any little girls at the manger. Girls were needed at home. They could not be spared. And in the frosty Christmas air, the bells rang joy to all the little girls in the world. Thank you.
We'll take a short break now and then come back, and there'll be an opportunity to ask any questions you might have.
Well, I subscribe to all these magazines, and then I get them and I cut out all the stories and I put them in a box. And then when I'm going to write something about them, I sit down and I read them all in the space of about 12 hours. And then I get some rest or try to eat something after an experience like that, and then I start writing. That's methodology, I guess. That's all there is to it. Some of them I've collected from neighbors of mine, especially Good Housekeeping. One has to have some principles, I guess, and I can't subscribe to that magazine. They are by far the most reactionary of the 4 that I was dealing with. They're very far behind any of the others. And I've asked some of my neighbors, the people I've gotten these from, if they read the stories, because I thought I'd do a little field work, and some interviews, things like that. Yeah, they read the stories. What do you think of them? Can't remember any of them. And I guess you can go 2 directions with that. I don't know if this means that they really don't have any effect at all and they're just dismissed, or if it means that they operate on a level of the consciousness where they simply reinforce, and one is not even aware of the kind of reinforcing they're doing. There's no style to be observed in any of them. There's nothing really memorable at all, and so I can see that one would find them eminently forgettable. But I think that they still do have an effect. If your lifestyle is like the one that they're promoting, then I think that they would tend to reinforce you, make you feel pretty good. It's all okay after all. If you're like me and your lifestyle is not anything at all like the one that they're talking about, they can be a very troubling sort of experience. For example, everybody worries about babysitters. I think if you use babysitters as I do, you always wonder, is this person really responsible? What's going to happen while you're gone? And ladies' magazines are just addicted to stories that show you the most awful babysitters imaginable. I mean, just frightening things. And I think they're trying to do a job on all kinds of readers, not just reinforcement, but they're trying to work on the people who don't live that way too. Yeah. Well, I wish I knew that. I'm very curious about it myself. For example, the Ladies' Home Journal prints stories written by only about 6 different writers, and half of them are male. Let's see, the last time I counted, I think a little bit over half of the stories I was dealing with had a male name attached to them. But then there's the other supposition, too, that, say, at the Ladies' Home Journal, there are boxes in the office marked Will Stanton, Meryl Joan Gerber, Rita Maddox. You write a story that fits that person's formula, you flip it in the box, and staff members pick up a little extra money that way. Because I can identify, if I cut the authors off at this point, I could identify a Will Stanton story in the journal. They're all the same. I could identify a Rita Maddox story. They're all the same. And I think one could possibly get a job just writing formulas and labeling them. This is a Will Stanton type. So I can say that more than half of the stories have a male name attached to them. Whether a male actually wrote them, I have no idea.
Do black women appear at all in these stories?
No, not one, never, not one, Do black women ever appear in these stories? Mm-mm. I have one story about a black male, except that his blackness is the O. Henry twist in the story. What happens is that I don't know where he's going, somewhere at night anyway, and 4 teenagers who are white pull him into a barn and force him, or try to force him, to rape a white girl. Now, you don't know that he's black all the way through this story. You only find this out at the end, and what it is supposed to mean in terms of the story is very unclear. But something deeply cultural, I guess. And that's the only black person that ever appeared. I said I only had that one Jewish family, the story I told you about. I had one Catholic family. That's about it. If you want to get into minorities, religious groups, anything like that, they're not there.
Yet
Mhm.
readership would, I assume, would be made up of minority groups. I don't understand.
Well,
Some of the readership.
some, yes. I find difficulty in seeing why any black woman would want to subscribe to one of these magazines. They're just super white. Everything you're shown in them is white. Any rituals, customs, fashions, you name it, it's all white, and I shouldn't think there would be much there for a black person, unless that person were just simply interested in some kind of status aspiration. That's all I can find in it. Linda, yeah.
Yeah, I know that you're not dealing with book conversations in the back of the journal, but I'm curious as to what assumptions you can make about why the journal printed Ireland in Stepford Wives when
Yeah.
something was the most incredibly turning around as a formula. I mean, women to kill if they wanted to reform.
Yeah, that was such an interesting thing to read, and there isn't time to get into that. Mostly one is used to their printing. Well, let's see, the one you're talking about is called The Stepford Wives. That ran in about 5 installments. I think it must be nearly the whole book. Yeah, usually these things are Gothic horrors, that variety. Somebody arriving at the castle late at night, all that kind of thing. But The Stepford Wives was different, very different. Yeah. Was about a number of women in the suburbs. The narrator is one who has just arrived there, and she finds some of them to be just ordinary people, kind of vaguely discontented with suburban life, whereas others are, tightly girdled and corseted and uplift brassieres and lipstick and beehive hairdos and keep these immaculate houses and never complain. And one by one, her friends, the ones she feels some empathy with, become like these others. She'll go over to somebody's house one day and there's this creature who is totally different from the woman the day before. So she does some research in the local newspaper, finds out that there was a women's association in town once, and the last meeting that they had was one at which they were addressed by Betty Friedan, and after that the women's association vanished. She tries to find out why. The last president of it tells her, well, we thought we'd rather just be an auxiliary to the men's association. That was more fun. And she can't figure out anything. So finally she starts looking into the backgrounds of some of the men her husband works with, and the key is that she finds that one did his work in audio animatronics, which is producing creatures like the ones at Disney World, you know. And that's what these women are. They're made out of, I don't know, styrofoam and all kinds of other things, and they're just ambulating around the house being happy. And finally, the narrator at the end is gotten by the audio animatronics experts too. Extraordinarily different thing to find in the journal. Although the journal is really dealing more and more with some very dark stuff, I think. A couple of years ago, one could read stories that they weren't humorous, but they were light. They were just meant to be enjoyable, you know, laugh a little. And these are gone now pretty much, and they're dealing with a lot of suggested marital problems. They aren't ever very well defined, but they're just suggestions that things are not as rosy as they were a couple years ago. And the journal had 2 stories just in the last couple of months that hinted at the husband's possible infidelity if things didn't improve in the home. And they're changing a little bit. That's the only direction they're changing in, I think, is that they're dealing with a little darker problems than they used to. Yeah.
Do you think that the absence of problems of 13 to 18-year-olds may have to do with the leadership of magazines, and they're not selling magazines, they're not being read by 13 to 18-year-olds?
Well, I'm sure they are not being read by people of that age. They are certainly being read by women who have children of that age, because the readership, especially of the journal, is getting older and older all the time. The magazines are not attracting that many young readers. And I'm not too sure how to explain that, Fred. I think sometimes that they don't want to deal with any problems surrounding puberty because they like to stay away from sex a lot. And if they got into those years, maybe they'd have to show the mother explaining something to the daughter or not explaining it. I don't know why they stay away from that age group so very carefully, 13 to 21. Nobody there. One of the reasons is, of course, that the married women they deal with are mostly young. That is, they're under 35. And so most of them would intend to have children that age. And so that may just be a very mechanical reason why they are not there.
Are there data on who reads these magazines?
One can get those things. I don't have them. One can get a breakdown state by state of how many copies of each of these magazines are delivered into each state, and I don't have that data. Cindy?
In the new Red Book issue that just came out, there's a reader survey. Red Book's done its own reader survey in the magazine. I haven't had time to read it.
How can you stand them?
I'm dedicated, Victoria. Don't you like to read them?
No.
I was talking to Hazel Hammer. I guess she left now, and she was telling me that she'd started the one about the professor of ancient history, and she'd read the first 3 paragraphs a couple times and finally gave up on it. She recognized the plot from the first couple paragraphs, but didn't continue any further with it. I don't know, I suppose my husband could testify that after I've sat down and read 150 of them in 12 hours, I'm in kind of a peculiar state. Dan?
Though I know such things are probably difficult to get at, in television soap opera, the writers are often guided by viewer responses in the form of written letters to the program, which are then channeled to the writer. And plot situations are developed or changed in sort of what seems to be the going thing in a given batch of letters. I wonder, do you know whether such things go into these magazines, letters?
I don't know. I looked over almost all the letters that they print, and they usually what they print are pro and con responses to some controversial article that they've done, usually on some new kind of diet, and pro and con on the diet, things like that. I don't recall running into any letters or any substantial number of letters that responded to the stories. Every once in a while they'll print one that says, "Your Christmas story in the December issue was truly inspirational," and that's about it. I've never read a letter, if they get them at all, that says anything that objects to the stories or even anything critical of them. Nothing at all. Yeah.
What you brought up was an interesting point, because on the soaps now, everybody's having abortions and smoking dope and doing these things, and that is reading audience is the same that would be that TV afternoon
You mean, why aren't they showing that kind of thing? Well, I think you're dealing with two different media that have two different purposes. I think the only purpose here is reinforcement in these stories, and reinforcement of the woman remaining in the home for reasons that I see as contributing to the economy, basically consumer reasons. Because the stories teach you to want a great many things, and they teach you ways to live that are probably the ways that you don't live, but you want to live that way. And I see them as more a part of the, more related to the advertising of the magazine than to anything else, and that they keep reinforcing this urge. You want to be at home so that you can focus all your attention on consuming. And consuming is a very, very important thing. Consuming the right things for your children, for yourself. If the women in these stories make any decisions at all that are important, those are consumer decisions. In fact, they're the only ones that they're allowed to make, really. And that's where they feel comfortable in deciding which of several different things to buy. And I think the purpose of the soaps, their appeal, is just so much different. Now, right alongside these stories in the Ladies' Home Journal or in McCall's or even in Redbook, you can read articles about abortion. And all sorts of things of the type that appear on the soaps, all kinds of problems like that, and controversial issues, but they just don't touch the stories ever. When they will, I don't know. I think that's why McCall stopped printing stories. They didn't want to print that kind of thing anymore, but the question is what to print. Yeah.